Thank you for inviting me to come and present some of this work today to everyone. So it was really hard for me to decide what to present and what to show everybody. But hopefully within this sort of 45-minute slot, I can give you a taste of what we've been doing in the lab and what we plan to go on to do next. So as Brian said, a lot of the work that I do looks at moral judgment action discrepancy. So why we say one thing and then do something completely different. And the work I'm focusing on today is really centered around these kind of sacrificial moral dilemmas and specifically the trolley problem. So just to give you a sense of what we're going to be, oh, is it going to work? Yay. So to give you a sense of how I've sort of broken up the talk today, we're going to start by talking about moral psychology. I'm not sure who here is a moral psychologist or not, so I wanted to make sure that everyone got a crash course in moral psychology before I dived into what I was doing. Then we'll move on to the use of virtual reality in the field and how we've been using it in the lab at Keele. And then I'm going to finish by sort of showing you how we've been extending that by incorporating other types of sort of extended realities and haptic feedback into the mix as well. And towards the end, I'll reflect on some of the limitations of these approaches, and I'm sure you will identify many of those, so I'm looking forward to the Q&A at the end. And then I'll also touch on sort of some extraneous factors or additional things we need to think about going forward. Okay, so before I start, a probably pretty important question is, what is morality? We all probably have a sense of what morality is. We probably disagree on what we think morality is. So when I ask each of you what you consider to be moral, we might have universal shared understandings of what's moral and what's immoral, but we might also have our own sense of what's moral and what's not moral based on our lived experience, based on our culture, based on how we grew up, lots of different factors. When I talk about morality, I like to think of it in terms of cases and situations. I think that's the best way to think about what morality actually is. So I'm going to use lots of different scenarios today, and the first one is this one. So I want you to all imagine that you've stood up and you've left this room, and you're going to walk down the street to get cash out of the bank. Maybe you're going to go to a sort of a point in the wall and get some money out. And what happens is when you get there, you notice that there's this big wad of cash just sticking out of the wall. Someone's forgotten to take it. So imagine it's kind of this big bag of money. Now, in that situation, what are you going to do? So you could take that and pocket it immediately. I'm sure some people would want to do that. You might stand there for a second and wait to see who's going to show up to retrieve it. So you might kind of guard it, weirdly. But you might also pick it up and kind of start waving it around and approaching people and asking them if it's their money. Maybe you're going to pick it up and go into the bank and ask them to look after it until someone comes to retrieve it. Everything you're doing in that situation is based on your moral values, right? It's based on what you think is going to be right and wrong in that situation. And that's how I like to think about morality. So it's what we think is right and wrong about our actions and thoughts in any kind of given context or scenario, but it's also these codes of conduct that are put forward by groups and by society, and that group element is really important. So what's moral psychology then? So moral psychology isn't just the study of morality, but it's the study of human thought and behavior in those specific ethical contexts. So in those environments, what we're doing, what humans believe is right and wrong, that's what moral psychology is really about. And one of the reasons why moral psychology is the best is because it's informed by both ethical theory and psychological fact. So it's this really nice hybrid discipline. And if you look at the origins of moral psychology, you'll see that it emerges from these two neighboring streams of interest in psychology and philosophy, but it's also informed by methods, theories, practices from all these different subfields in psychology, so cognitive, social, evolutionary, personality psychology, and developmental psychology. So in my department, nobody knows what to call me, because I do all of these things. But interestingly, we also have inputs from these other disciplines, importantly philosophy, but you'll also see practices and theories coming from criminology, neuroscience, sociology, and anthropology. So if anyone is an all-rounder, or if you find lots of different disciplines interesting, then moral psychology is probably the topic for you. It certainly has been for me. But this is sort of a crash course in moral psychology. So as a psychologist, I'm interested in measuring these kinds of constructs. And if you want to measure something, you've got to make it operationalizable. And that's really difficult. So how do you measure something like morality? This big, multifaceted concept that has individual differences at play, cultural differences at play. How do you measure something like that? And what we tend to do is break it down into sort of sub-constructs or component parts. And I'm going to talk about the two that I'm most interested in, which we've touched on already. So the first is how people make moral judgments. So moral judgments as a construct. How do people decide what's right and what's wrong, what's good and what's bad? And I'm really interested in modeling what that looks like. But as a psychologist, I'm not necessarily just interested in what people think. I'm also interested in what they do. And this is the other construct that I'm really interested in, moral action. So how do people act in light of those moral judgments? So how are people going to behave based on what they believe is right and wrong, good and bad? And obviously, emotion and motivation play really important roles here as well. So not only do they predict these things, you know, when you engage in a certain moral judgment or you perform a certain moral action, certain moral emotions will be generated as a result of that. Okay, so we've got this big construct of morality. We've now broken it down into the parts that we're interested in. And now it's a case of thinking about how we might measure those different things. So how am I going to measure someone's moral judgments? How am I going to measure someone's moral behavior or their moral actions? Well, I need to put them in a situation where they're going to have to think about what's right and wrong and what's good or bad. Or I'm going to have to put them in a situation where they're going to have to make a decision or they're going to have to act in some way based on that. And the typical thing and the typical way of doing that is to use moral dilemmas, right? Dilemmas, because there are two requirements in those situations. There's a conflict between these requirements. And those moral dilemmas can have different things at stake. So let's do some more scenarios together because they're fun. So I want you to get up again imaginatively and leave the room. And this time you're going to rush for a bus. So you're going to be rushing through Oxford to catch a bus. And it's really important that you catch this bus, and it's, you know, you're already late. And what happens in front of you while you're rushing for this bus is a young mother trips and she falls and she drops her shopping all over the floor. So there's apples and bananas rolling everywhere. And again, you've got to make a decision. So in this situation, you could either stop and help this individual, but if you stop and help, you will definitely miss your bus. Or you could run past as quickly as you can. You're going to fail to help, but you will catch your bus on time. And then we can change the stakes, or we can raise the stakes. So we could say that perhaps you're rushing for the bus because actually you have a family member that relies on you for their own health or their own care. And if you miss the bus, you're going to fail to give them medication on time or something like that. So in that situation, you're deciding what you need to do. And we can up the stakes further or change the context. So imagine a case where you witness a bank robbery, but you know the person who committed the crime, and you know the reason they're committing that crime is because they need to source money urgently for treatment for a loved one. So again, you're faced with this dilemma. Do you report the crime knowing the money gets returned to the bank, or do you ignore the crime despite it going against your values that actually stealing is wrong? So these are all cases and all situations where hopefully you can see these provide you with the opportunity to see how people respond, so they allow you to see what people believe is right and wrong in those situations. Now, I'm really interested in really high stakes and high risk moral decision making. So I'm interested in life and death decision making. And in order to study those kinds of decisions, we use a specific type of moral dilemma called a sacrificial moral dilemma. And hopefully you all have heard of the most famous one of these, which is the trolley problem. Can I get a sense of who has heard of the trolley problem? Okay, so I'm going to go through it anyway because I want to see what everybody says, but it's good to know we have a room of trolley. I was going to say trolley enthusiasts, but I think that's an assumption. But let's go through them together. So generally, when we talk about the trolley problem, we can divide it into sort of two parts or two halves, the switch dilemma and the footbridge dilemma. Some people call them slightly different things, but I'll talk through both. So let's start with the switch dilemma. So I want you to imagine that these events are playing out, and then I'm going to ask you what you would do in these situations. So, I want you to imagine that there's a runaway trolley or a runaway train car heading down a set of train tracks, and it's completely out of control. And it's heading down these tracks at speed, and it's heading towards 5 construction workers. You can see them on the right-hand side of the track. They can't hear it approaching. You have no way of warning them. But you are standing next to a switch which operates some points in the track. So if you flick that switch, this runaway trolley will head down a neighboring track instead on the left, where there's only 1 construction worker. So here I'm going to ask you, do you think it's morally acceptable to flick the switch, sacrificing 1 life in order to save 5 lives? So who thinks that that's morally acceptable? Do you want to raise your hand? Okay. That was actually really nice. So you all represented the data really nicely. So generally, you get this preference for saying yes in response to this question. So around 80% of people say, yes, it's morally acceptable to do this. Now, moral psychologists tend to call this a utilitarian response. I like to use the phrase characteristically utilitarian because I think it's quite an assumption to say that it's utilitarian, but we're going to call it characteristically utilitarian for the purposes of the talk. So we're assuming that by choosing to sacrifice 1 life in order to save many more lives, we're kind of maximizing the greatest outcome for the greatest number of people. Okay, so now let's look at the counterpart moral dilemma, which some people are less familiar with, but you probably aren't, but let's go through it together. So in this scenario, the same events are playing out. So we have that runaway train car heading down the track again towards these 5 construction workers. If it continues on its course, it's going to hit and kill them. Again, they're too far away for you to warn them. But in this situation, there's a bridge over the scene, and you're standing on this bridge. And in front of you is somebody wearing a really large, heavy rucksack or a heavy backpack. And in this situation, what you could do is push that person off the footbridge onto the track below. And if that runaway train car hits them, it will sort of collide with the bulk and derail. So again, you're making a decision about whether to sacrifice 1 life in order to save 5 lives. So I'm going to ask you a similar question. Is it morally acceptable to push the person off the footbridge, sacrificing 1 life in order to save 5 lives? So who thinks this is morally acceptable? Okay, a few hands. This is perfect. You're mirroring the data so well. So that was about 4 people. So generally, you see a much lower sort of rate of this sort of characteristically utilitarian endorsement. So now only about 20% of people say, yes, it's morally acceptable. Now, there's been many attempts to explain why you see such differences in these 2 types of moral dilemmas, despite their structural similarities. So they both entail that 1 to 5 trade-off. So there's been a lot of interest in trying to understand why there are these differences. And I'm not going to focus on all of those theories right now. I'm going to present one of the sort of early theories in moral psychology. And the reason I'm doing that is because I want to come back to it later when I talk to you about the virtual reality research. So I'm going to give you a brief explanation of this theory that was developed by Joshua Green. And this tries to explain why you get these different responses. So remember, for the switch type moral dilemmas, you're getting about 80% of these characteristically utilitarian endorsements. The footbridge, you're only getting 20%. And this theory argues that the reason you see these differences is in the footbridge type cases, these kind of up-close personal cases, when you read what's required of you, so when you read that you have to physically harm someone, you get this immediate aversive emotional reaction. And it's that immediate aversive response that drives these kind of non-utilitarian decisions. So that's why everybody says, no way, it's not morally acceptable. Whereas in the switch type cases, when you read what's required, you don't get that same immediate aversive emotional reaction, right? Hopefully you all experienced something like this when you were reading the cases or when I was walking you through the cases. Here, you're just sort of flicking a mechanical switch. So in the absence of that immediate aversive emotional reaction, the theory is these kind of more controlled cognitive mechanisms can drive the decision making. And that's why you get so many more people giving this sort of so-called utilitarian response instead. Hopefully that's clear to everyone. And we're going to come back to this later, so I want you to pocket that knowledge because I'm going to refer back to it later. So when I started my PhD, and this was back in 2014, there was a lot of interest in these models and developing new ones and lots of criticism around them. But I actually became really interested in moral psychology purely out of measurement reasons. So I'm really interested in how we measure stuff. I think that's really interesting. And so now I'm going to explain why I think this is interesting. So if you are a typical participant coming to a moral psychology research lab, and we're going to look at your moral judgments in response to these kinds of cases, typically we would present you with a text-based version of one of these moral dilemmas. So this is a vignette version of the footbridge dilemma. So you wouldn't even get the diagrams or the images that I just showed to you. You would just get this text description, and then I'd get you to read it, and I'd ask you to respond to some questions. So maybe I'd ask you, like I just did, is it morally acceptable to do this particular thing? And you might respond on a binary scale, so you might say yes or no, or you might respond on a Likert type scale from, it's completely morally unacceptable to completely morally acceptable. And then in later work, researchers introduced this bottom question: would you do it? And they called that an action choice question. And they started to find some differences in how people were responding to these two questions. And I'm sure you can see why there would be differences. But it troubled me that the bottom question was being called an action choice, because to me it still feels very hypothetical in nature. It still requires you to imagine what you might do in that particular situation, when all the contextual features are at play and when you're kind of in the pressure of that situation. What's even more interesting is the research that we have now looking at moral inconsistency. So we have a good amount of empirical evidence that what people say and what people do are not the same. I'm sure we know this from everyday life anyway. People display huge amounts of moral inconsistency, and it doesn't have to just be in these kinds of high-stakes scenarios. Let's do another imagined scenario. If we go outside now with a survey and we ask people their moral views on recycling, whether they think it's morally required, whether they think it's morally acceptable, most people will say, yes, of course, I recycle, it's important, we need to do it. And then we break into their houses, which we shouldn't do, but we're going to break into their houses and then rifle through their bins. I'm sure many people are not recycling in the way that they claim they are or they should be. So there is a good amount of evidence for moral inconsistency. But when it comes to studying moral actions in this area of research, so we're talking about morality of harm, we're talking about these really extreme, far-fetched trolley-type problems, we face a huge number of challenges. And I think there are two central challenges. The first is an ethical challenge. So it would be completely unethical for me to expose participants coming to my lab to these life and death decisions, and that would not be appropriate at all. But probably the biggest challenge is a methodological one. So if we all left the room right now and walked to Oxford train station, we're probably not going to come across the footbridge dilemma happening or the switch dilemma. And in fact, if you walked there every day for the next 3 years, you probably wouldn't see an event like that taking place. So these are these kind of really extreme cases that are hard to observe people's actions in. So there are two big challenges there. And this is where virtual and extended reality slot into the picture. So they provide a solution for both of these. So they allow you to simulate moral dilemmas that can both look and feel very realistic while protecting the welfare of participants. And there's a good amount of evidence now that virtual reality provides a really nice balance between aspects of experimental realism and experimental control. So this was my PhD research, and that's where the interest sort of sparked, and that's where this research stream started from. So in the sort of early years of doing this work, one of the first things that we did was we built a virtual reality version of the footbridge dilemma. And you can see one of the really early screenshots of this moral dilemma at the top. At the bottom, you can see other sacrificial moral dilemmas that we've used afterwards. I'll talk more about those afterwards. But in the top, you can get a sense of what those original virtual reality simulations looked like. And before I talk you through some of the results of these studies, I just want to highlight the key differences between a virtual reality moral dilemma and a text-based vignette. explaining the same moral dilemma. It might seem obvious, but I just want you to keep these differences in mind because they're really important. So in a virtual reality moral dilemma, there's visual and auditory salience. You do not have that at all in a text-based vignette. You, as a researcher, are designing every single part of what that scene looks like and what it sounds like. So you're deciding what the avatars look like, so the people in here, in the footbridge case, what the people standing on the tracks look like, what they're wearing, what they're saying, how they're moving. Everything about that you're determining. It no longer relies on imagination. Even the environment itself, so is it a barren landscape? What time of the year is it? What time of day is it? What's the weather like? Can you hear wind in your ears when you're in that experience? It changes everything. Importantly, you can also measure actions in the moment of decision-making in a virtual reality moral dilemma. So the events play out in real time as they would in real life, and you're not relying on a participant's reading speed. So there are these really fundamental differences in the mode of presentation, and it's worth keeping those in mind when I show you the data. Okay, so I'm going to walk you through a set of experiments that we conducted, and these are kind of split into sort of 3 types of experiments. But I'll show you the original VR experiments first. So in these first studies, we were simply interested in looking at whether actions in virtual reality moral dilemmas would be the same as, or whether they would be different to, moral judgments made in response to those text-based counterparts. So that was sort of the original research. And I will show you the results of the first study that I ever conducted using virtual reality. So in this study, we had 2 groups of people. The first group of people responded to just the footbridge dilemma in the original text-based format, and I asked them, is it morally acceptable to do this? Would you do it? So I asked them both a judgment question and an action choice question. We'll call those the text condition. And then we had a second group of participants, and this group of participants was immersed in that virtual reality version of the footbridge dilemma instead. And the response is different in that environment. So this was back when Oculus had just released its development headsets. I don't know if there's anyone who's super into tech or VR here, but this was a long time ago now. So this was when they didn't have associated hand controllers. So we had to plug in a joystick into the headset, so they'd kind of hold a joystick. And if they wanted to push the person, they would push the joystick forward. And then if they didn't want to endorse that response, they'd just do nothing. So it was kind of a mission of an action. We'll call them the VR condition. So what I'll do is I'll show you the text-based results first. So along the y-axis, you've got the percentage of responses. The dark bars are the characteristically utilitarian responses, right? So that's when people have said, in response to the text-based version, yes, it's morally acceptable, yes, I would do it. The first thing you notice is the data is exactly how we would expect it to look. So very few people say, yes, it's morally acceptable to push the person off the bridge, yes, I would do it, which mirrors our own experiment that we ran at the beginning. So only 4 of you had your hands up, so that looks good. The white bars are the non-utilitarian responses. What happened in virtual reality then, when people were immersed in this virtual version of the footbridge and they had to physically act, or they had to simulate an action? That was very different. So in the virtual reality simulation, we got this kind of flip pattern of responses. So now we had around 76% of people endorsing that utilitarian outcome. So that meant in VR, they were pushing the virtual person off the footbridge. I was really surprised by this data at the beginning, and I'll talk more about why I was shortly. But the first thing that we did, so this was with psychology undergraduate students, who are an interesting type of student. I was one of them. So the first thing that I did was replicate this with the general public. So we then ran a second study with the general public and found the same flip pattern of responses. I also ran some studies with trained professionals who deal with these kind of immediate, up-close, very difficult moral decisions on a regular basis. So I ran the same study with training paramedics at Plymouth University, and you can see they showed the same flip pattern of responses. So the dark bars are still the utilitarian responses. And I also ran it a few years later with incident commanders working in the Devon and Somerset Fire and Rescue Service. And they still showed the same flip pattern of responses. And it's worth saying as well that obviously this is within subjects. So for these two studies, it's the same people responding to both, which is worth thinking about. And I can talk more about that afterwards if anyone's interested. Okay, so that was sort of a few years of work where I was increasingly surprised, but I wasn't happy with the way that we were doing this. And again, this went back to my interest in measurement and making methods valid and accurate. And one of the reasons why I wasn't completely happy was because in all of these studies that we'd conducted so far, we weren't thinking about the role of personal force and physical contact. So physical contact makes a big difference in terms of what actions you take. It's much harder to harm someone physically with your hands than it is to do it remotely through another object. And so at the moment, we had participants holding this kind of joystick. It didn't really feel like anything other than a joystick. And it's also worth thinking about things like affordance effects, so people just kind of pushing that forward because it's designed to be pushed forward. And so I really wanted to incorporate touch, physical contact. And I decided to do that using haptic technology. And in the first study I'm going to show you, I used this piece of equipment. So this is a virtual reality robotic device, so it's called a V-bot. And the V-bot is essentially a really huge robotic arm. And it generates physical resistance force. And that physical resistance force makes actions feel very realistic. So if, for example, you wanted to simulate the sensation of moving your arm through choppy water, you can do that using this equipment. You can generate the feeling of sort of pushing against the surface of a brick wall. So you can do really sort of small texture feeling as well. And so what we decided to do was use this with moral dilemmas. So we had participants viewing moral dilemmas and then responding with this haptic arm. And in doing so, we could generate the feeling of actually having performed that action. So for example, if they're responding to the footbridge dilemma and they choose to endorse the utilitarian response, they push forward with the robotic arm as if they were pushing in real life. And it would feel as though you were making contact with a large, heavy object that if you pushed hard enough would kind of spring away from you. And then we could customize that to different types of moral actions. So in this study, we decided to incorporate 15 different moral dilemmas. So we didn't just use the footbridge dilemma. They were all footbridge type dilemmas. So they all had this up close and personal feature. So I'm going to walk you through the data for this one then. So exactly the same setup as before. So two different groups of people. The first group of participants respond in the traditional format. So they get all the 15 moral dilemmas, and then they respond to the questions, is it morally acceptable, would you do it? So just as in the previous experiment, but 15 different moral dilemmas. The second group responds to the moral dilemmas, but this time using the haptic virtual reality system. So we're making those actions feel real. So we'll call them the haptic VR condition. So I'll show you the data for the sort of traditional format first. So again, this is average now across 15 different moral dilemmas. But again, you've got responses on the y-axis. The dark bars are the utilitarian responses. So you can see again, there's a preference for saying, no, it's not morally acceptable. No, I wouldn't do it, which we expect in response to these really up close and aversive moral dilemmas. What happens in the other condition, where participants had to simulate actions that felt more realistic, was again different. So you don't get this preference for non-utilitarian responses. You still get averaged across those 15 different cases, more individuals choosing to endorse that utilitarian response. So in the footbridge dilemma, for example, they're choosing to push again. Okay. But I still wasn't happy. And that was because there was no sense of corporeal sensation. So you're not touching a human body, you're still holding this robotic arm. It might generate this physical resistance force and give you haptic feedback that feels very realistic, but it's still missing the element of human touch and human contact. And so in this study, I worked really closely with a speculative designer called Aggie Haynes. And we decided to build a response device that could be paired with what we did in virtual reality. So this was essentially a large sculpture of a person's back, and it was designed to be paired with the virtual reality footbridge dilemma. And so we were essentially going for this full kind of bodily immersive experience. I'll show you a diagram of this structure now. So the way that this worked was the torso of this structure was built from platinum-grade silicon and expanding foam, but beneath it was this network of heated wiring. Don't know if anyone's touched platinum-grade silicon that's not warm. It is really weird. It feels really bizarre. So combined together with a t-shirt over the top, this would really create the feeling of you touching a human body. It was also weighted to the weight of someone that size. So if the participant who was sort of immersed in the VR footbridge dilemma wanted to push the person off the footbridge, they really would have to push hard for that to be effective, in some cases with both hands, in order for that to be successful. If they were successful, that torso would fall forward past a set of kind of resistance springs, so it would make it feel like it was falling, along a runner, and that would sync with what was happening in virtual reality. So in VR, if you push this sculpture, it's in exactly the same place and location as that virtual avatar. If you push and it's successful, that avatar is then pushed. So that's kind of the way the setup worked. Okay, so again, let's look at the data together. So exactly the same setup as before, two separate groups of people. We have one group responding to the text-based version of the footbridge dilemma, as in all the other studies. And then we have this other group who are immersed in the VR footbridge dilemma, this time having to respond with this real body-like object. We're going to call them the VR sculpture condition. So I'll show you the text-based data first. So it's the same as you would expect. So this time, very few individuals, less than 20%, gave a utilitarian response. And for the most part, 90+% are saying, no, it's not morally acceptable to push the person. No, I wouldn't do it, which again is what we would expect. Now, what happened in this kind of virtual reality simulation, this time when this very physically real feeling object had to be pushed with force, was again very different. So you still see that there isn't this preference for sort of endorsing these non-utilitarian responses. Okay, so let's talk about what's happening in virtual reality. And I'm really interested in hearing your thoughts and your questions afterwards as well. So we've been testing a few theories about what happens in virtual reality. And I'm just going to talk you through two. And the first thing I want to talk to you about, or the first thing I want to go back to, is Josh Green's model of moral judgment, and whether it can explain what's happening in our data. So what I did was I went back and I looked at all of the studies that we'd run in the VR lab, and I averaged the utilitarian responses for all the cases where it was a text-based vignette and they were being asked to make a moral judgment. And averaging all those together gives you a 20% utilitarian endorsement rate. Now, that aligns nicely with Green's dual process model, because remember what that model says. When you get these footbridge-type up-close personal moral dilemmas, you get this immediate aversive reaction at the thought of what you have to do. And so most people are going to go, no, it's not morally acceptable, no, I'm not going to do it. So that model does explain all of our moral judgment data, right? That aligns nicely. What it doesn't explain so nicely is what happens with virtual action. So if I take all of the virtual reality-based studies, including Haptic VR studies that we've run in the lab, and I average the utilitarian endorsements, so that's people physically carrying out this moral action, it's 65% of these characteristically utilitarian endorsements. Now, if Green's model could explain that, I would actually expect even fewer utilitarian actions in virtual reality. Firstly, because again, it's up close, intense moral decisions, but also VR makes everything much more emotionally salient, and physiological arousal is much higher in virtual reality. So I'd actually expect even fewer endorsements in VR, not more. So what's going on then? So one of the theories we've been testing at the moment is an adapted version of Fiery Cushman's action outcome value model. And essentially what we're saying is that what happens in virtual reality changes what drives your moral decision making. So when you read a text-based moral dilemma, you're having to imagine that 1 to 5 comparison, right, as you read that text-based case. In virtual reality, you're no longer relying on imagination. Everything's right there in front of you, it's very salient. You can see those 5 individuals on the track in front of you. And so the idea is that perhaps the thought of seeing those individuals die is assigned a greater negative value than you having to actually harm one person. So it could be that VR changes how values are assigned to actions and outcomes in these cases. But it's also worth thinking about perspectives. And this is a theory adapted from Tassi et al.'s work. So if you think about yourself reading a text-based moral dilemma and then being asked some moral judgments, is it morally acceptable to do this? You might be thinking about what other people would require of you in that situation. You might be thinking of those expectations. So decision-making could be more allocentric. So you might be thinking about the interests of others when you make those decisions. In virtual reality, you are immersed in a space and you're closed off from everybody else. In the pressure of the moment, it feels very different making decisions. And so that might become more egocentric. You're thinking about the consequences of your own actions. And so it might be that you're acting in the interests of yourself instead. Testing both of these theories has been incredibly difficult. And I can talk more about how we've been trying to do that. But if anyone has any amazing ideas, please come and talk to me, because I'd really welcome those. So those are just 2 theories that we've been testing and looking at. So the real question then is this evidence of moral judgment action discrepancy? And I think this is a really difficult question to answer. So instead of answering it, I'm just going to show you what evidence we have in favor of there being a moral judgment action discrepancy here. So as it stands now, we have several papers and several studies showing that there does appear to be a moral judgment action discrepancy when we're focusing on these VR sacrificial moral dilemmas. So you can see here another version of the footbridge dilemma that we've been using in the lab. This is kind of in a barren landscape, and this is filmed from the perspective of someone inside the headset. So we now have multiple papers showing this discrepancy, and there are several other labs now who found the same thing. But what about beyond these kind of really extreme, sometimes far-fetched and comical situations? So do we see evidence beyond that? So there was some really great research done by Indrajit Patil in 2018 that used virtual reality altruistic moral dilemmas instead. So in these cases, an individual is trying to flee a burning building. And as they're trying to flee, they come across this individual that you can see here who's trapped. And what they have to choose to do is either pause and help this individual at risk to themselves, or they could just leave this person and flee the building as quickly as possible. And what Patil et al. Did was they presented these as text-based vignettes and looked at moral judgments, and they also ran them in virtual reality. And what was really interesting was that in the sort of judgment conditions with the text-based cases, most people said, you know what, I would definitely sacrifice myself, I would definitely stop and save this individual. And in virtual reality, something very different happened, and actually the majority of people fled the scene to save themselves. So we seem to find the same discrepancy even when we're moving away from these sacrificial moral dilemmas. And then
in the altruistic one, they still fled, you're saying?
Yeah, so in the altruistic VR, they just left. I think it was around 70% as well, so it aligned quite nicely with our data. And then in the same year, a little bit later, Dries Boston did sort of a lab-based behavioral version of some of this work. So in this study, I appreciate the images might be small for those of you at the back, but I'll explain what's in the scene. So participants would be presented with this particular scenario. So that on in the box on the left, there's a single mouse, and in the box on the right, there are 5 mice. And participants are told that a lethal electric shock is going to be administered to the 5 mice unless they redirect it to the box with the 1 mouse. Now, they're led to believe that that's real. It's actually not real, so no mice were harmed. And what Dries Boston did was he also presented this as a text-based vignette and asked for moral judgments. And they actually mirrored our results for the sacrificial moral dilemmas. So on paper, everybody said, no way, I wouldn't do it. But in the behavioral study where they actually had to do it in sort of the heat of the moment, many people did. So you can see here that we seem to have evidence now in several different areas that go beyond these kind of far-fetched cases. I have a lot more to say about that and where we need to take that further before I'm convinced of strong evidence. But you get a sense of where we kind of are in the field at the moment. Okay, there are a couple of points I want to make about controlling for extraneous factors and other variables in these studies, and I'm sure that you will have questions about this as well. But the first thing you might be thinking about is gaming. So a lot of the virtual reality moral dilemmas that we create look like gaming environments. And so there's a question around whether individuals are just doing things for the sake of it or whether their prior gaming experience affects what they do. And I'm just going to give you an idea of the kinds of things we've been doing to control for this or study it. And it's definitely not foolproof. So again, if anyone has ideas, please come and talk to me. So obviously, in all of the studies, we control for prior, current gaming experience and expertise, also type of game. I think that's very important. In the early days, it wasn't important to control for virtual reality experience because nobody had tried virtual reality. Now, 50% of participants have VR headsets at home, so that's becoming increasingly important to control for and take into account. We also have to think about affordance effects, and I briefly talked about that before. So we've tried to move away from using devices that produce this desire to kind of move them in the direction that would then produce the utilitarian response in virtual reality. That's become easier to control for because now we have handheld VR controllers that have embedded haptics in them, and we also have really accurate hand tracking now. So we have some versions of VR moral dilemmas now where you don't hold controllers at all, you actually use your own hands to carry out the action. What we also do is we ask participants for their reasoning. Obviously, this reasoning is post hoc, so it's not perfect. They could be sort of generating or justifying their decisions after the fact. But for the most part, you do see these kind of morally relevant reasons for their decisions. So this is one example of a quote from a participant who did push in virtual reality. It is better to save the lives of the many, not just the one. So that's one way that we can kind of check. And then the other point that I want to make is about context. So when I was working with the fire service, I realized that across the UK now, fire service professionals do a lot of their training in big virtual reality centres, and that's where I was working with them. And incident commanders, who are the individuals who go to the scene and they manage the decision making, so who's going in, should we take risks, they have to complete an assessment every 12 months to retain that title of incident commander. And all of that is now done through VR simulations. And so I posed a similar question to the trainer, the incident commander trainer. I said, how do you know that what they're doing in virtual reality remotely reflects what they would do in a real life situation? How do you know they're not taking more risks in this situation? How do you know they're taking it seriously? And he said it's all about context. Nobody goes into virtual reality thinking that they're playing a game, and we definitely emulate that in all of our lab-based studies. So I would hope that most participants don't come into the psychology lab thinking they're going to fool around. So there are a few things we can try to do, but I'm happy to answer more questions about that. And then I'm just going to finish on what we're doing at the moment, and this is just a taster of some of the things we're doing, and I'm happy to talk more about other projects. So we're now moving on to study action emission bias in virtual reality and also third-person judgments in VR. So with my collaborator Marcus Neer in Switzerland, we've just finished collecting data over there for both these projects. And you can see in the screenshots a new version of the footbridge dilemma, and this one's designed to try to look and feel more plausible. In the middle picture, you can see what that third-person experiment looks like. So as a user, you go into that virtual environment and you watch somebody else perform the moral decision, and then you make judgments about that. So we wanted to see if that was different in VR. And then finally, with my colleague Ethan Landers, who's also based in Switzerland at the moment, we're doing a study looking at philosophers' thoughts about these virtual reality trolley problems. So we've been putting philosophers and trained ethicists into VR, and we've been looking at whether they show the same judgment-action discrepancy, but also what they think about that experience and whether it's changed how they think about these kinds of hypothetical cases. And we should have the data for these really soon, so I can't wait to start sharing that with everyone. So I'm going to wrap up. So I just want to thank all of the amazing people that I work with, and this is just a handful of them, because none of this would be possible without them. So my PhD supervisors, way back when, all the students who work in the Keele Morality Lab, and then my key collaborators who helped with all the work that I've presented today. And yeah, thank you all so much for listening.